Hello and welcome. In this video, we're going to explore one of history's most enduring mysteries, the lost city of Atlantis. A civilization so advanced, so powerful, that its very existence challenges everything we think we know about the ancient world. For thousands of years, scholars, explorers, and dreamers have searched for this legendary island. Some call it myth, others believe it was real. Tonight, we'll walk through the evidence, the stories, and the questions that continue to haunt us. So settle in, relax, and let's begin this journey together. The story of Atlantis begins not in the distant mists of prehistory, but in ancient Athens, around 360 BCE. It was the philosopher Plato who first brought Atlantis into the light of recorded history. In two of his dialogues, the Timaeus and the Critias, Plato described a magnificent island civilization that existed 9,000 years before his own time. This means, according to Plato's timeline, Atlantis would have flourished around 9600 BCE, at the end of the last ice age. But Plato didn't claim to have invented this story. He said it came to him through his ancestor Solon, one of Athens's great lawgivers. Solon had traveled to Egypt, to the ancient city of Sais in the Nile Delta. There, Egyptian priests shared with him the tale of Atlantis, a story they claimed was preserved in their most sacred and ancient records. These priests spoke of a time when the gods walked among men, when the world was young, and when a great island empire rose to heights of power and sophistication that would not be seen again for millennia. The priests told Solon that Atlantis lay beyond the Pillars of Hercules. Today, we know these pillars as the Strait of Gibraltar, the narrow passage between Spain and Morocco where the Mediterranean Sea meets the Atlantic Ocean. Beyond this gateway, in the vast Atlantic, there existed an island larger than Libya and Asia combined. To ancient Greeks, this would have meant an enormous landmass, perhaps the size of a small continent. Atlantis was not just any island. According to the Egyptian priests, it was the heart of a mighty empire. The Atlanteans had conquered parts of Europe and Africa. They had brought distant lands under their control. Their ships sailed freely across the oceans. Their armies were formidable. Their wealth was beyond measure. But this empire was not destined to last forever. What's fascinating about Plato's account is the level of detail he provides. This isn't a simple fairy tale. Plato describes the geography of Atlantis with precision. He talks about its political structure, its military organization, its resources and trade. He describes the layout of the capital city, the materials used in its construction, even the specific metals that were mined there. For a myth, it contains an unusual amount of practical information. Some scholars believe Plato invented Atlantis as a philosophical allegory. They argue he created this story to illustrate his political theories, to show what happens when a civilization becomes too proud, too wealthy, too focused on material power. In Plato's telling, Atlantis serves as a warning. It demonstrates how even the mightiest empire can fall when it loses its moral compass, when it becomes corrupt and forgets the values that made it great. But others wonder if there might be more to it. Why would Plato go to such lengths to describe a fictional place? Why would he claim the story came from Egyptian priests? Why would he include so many specific details about geography, architecture, and social organization? These questions have fueled debate for over 2,000 years. The Egyptian connection is particularly intriguing. Egypt had one of the longest continuous civilizations in human history. By Plato's time, Egyptian culture had already endured for 3,000 years. The Egyptians kept meticulous records. They carved their history into stone, ensuring it would survive the ages. If anyone in the ancient world would have known about a prehistoric civilization, it would have been the Egyptians. We also know that ancient cultures had longer memories than we sometimes give them credit for. Oral traditions can preserve information across vast stretches of time. Stories passed from generation to generation can retain kernels of truth, even as they evolve and change. Aboriginal Australians have oral histories that accurately describe geological events from over 10,000 years ago. Could the Egyptians have preserved knowledge of a real civilization that existed at the end of the Ice Age? The timing Plato gives us is significant. He places Atlantis around 9600 BCE. This was a period of dramatic change in Earth's history. The last ice age was ending. Massive ice sheets that had covered much of the northern hemisphere were melting. Sea levels were rising rapidly. Coastlines were transforming. Entire landscapes were being drowned. If there was a great coastal civilization during this period, it would have been vulnerable to catastrophic flooding. Geological evidence shows us that sea levels rose by over 120 meters as the Ice Age ended. This happened over several thousand years, but there were periods of particularly rapid rise. Some scientists believe there may have been catastrophic flooding events, moments when natural ice dams broke and enormous volumes of water rushed into the oceans. Such events would have been devastating to any coastal settlements. Consider what we've learned about prehistoric human capabilities. For a long time, we believed that complex civilization only emerged around 3000 BCE, with the rise of Sumer and ancient Egypt. But recent discoveries have challenged this timeline. Sites like Göbekli Tepe in Turkey show that humans were building sophisticated stone monuments as early as 9500 BCE. This is roughly the same period Plato assigns to Atlantis. We're learning that our ancestors were more advanced, more organized, and more capable than we previously thought. The story of Atlantis, as Plato tells it, begins with the god Poseidon. The sea god fell in love with a mortal woman named Cleito, who lived on the island. To protect her, Poseidon shaped the land itself. He created a series of concentric rings, alternating between land and water, with Cleito's dwelling at the center. This became the foundation for the capital city of Atlantis, a place of extraordinary beauty and engineering. The children of Poseidon and Cleito became the first rulers of Atlantis. The eldest son, Atlas, gave his name to the island and the surrounding ocean. Atlas and his brothers divided the island into 10 kingdoms, each ruled by one of Poseidon's sons. They established laws, built cities, and developed a thriving civilization. For generations, they ruled justly, following the divine principles given to them by their immortal father. The capital city of Atlantis was described as a marvel of ancient engineering. The concentric rings created by Poseidon were enhanced and expanded. Bridges connected the rings. Tunnels allowed ships to pass from the outer ocean into the inner harbors. The rings of land were lined with walls, each covered in different metals. The outermost wall was coated with brass. The next was covered in tin. The innermost wall, surrounding the citadel, gleamed with orichalcum, a mysterious metal that Plato describes as second only to gold in value. At the center of the city stood temples and palaces of breathtaking grandeur. The Temple of Poseidon was especially magnificent. Its exterior was covered in silver, its pinnacles in gold. Inside stood a giant statue of the god himself, driving a chariot pulled by winged horses, surrounded by sea nymphs riding dolphins. The ceiling was decorated with ivory, and precious metals adorned every surface. The island itself was rich in resources. It produced abundant food. Its mines yielded metals, including the mysterious orichalcum. Its forest provided timber for ships. Hot and cold springs offered fresh water. The Atlanteans had access to everything they needed to build a great civilization. They traded with distant lands. Their merchant ships carried goods across the seas. Their influence spread far and wide. But Atlantis was not just wealthy. It was also militarily powerful. The Atlantean army was vast and well organized. They had thousands of war chariots. Their navy was formidable, with over 1,000 ships. They established colonies and conquered territories. According to Plato, they controlled lands in Europe as far as Tyrrhenia, which we know as Tuscany in modern Italy, and in Africa as far as Egypt. This military expansion eventually brought Atlantis into conflict with Athens. Here, Plato weaves Atlantis into the story of his own city. He describes how the Atlanteans attempted to invade and enslave the people of the Mediterranean. Athens, though much smaller, stood against them. In a great war, the Athenians defeated the Atlantean forces, liberating the conquered peoples and preventing the empire from expanding further. But this victory would prove hollow. Shortly after the war, a terrible catastrophe struck. In a single day and night, The island of Atlantis was destroyed. Earthquakes shook the land. The earth opened up. The sea rose and overwhelmed the island. The entire civilization, with all its wealth and power, disappeared beneath the waves. The Atlantean Empire was no more. Only the memory survived, preserved in Egyptian records and eventually passed down to Plato. This catastrophic destruction is one of the most debated aspects of the Atlantis story. Could a civilization really disappear so completely in just one day? From a geological perspective, it's not impossible. We know that catastrophic events can and do occur. Volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, tsunamis. These can devastate coastal areas with terrifying speed. The eruption of Mount Vesuvius buried Pompeii in a single day. The 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami killed hundreds of thousands of people in a matter of hours. Nature is capable of swift and overwhelming destruction. Some researchers point to volcanic islands as possible inspirations for the Atlantis story. Volcanic islands can literally disappear. The island of Krakatoa was mostly destroyed in an eruption in 1883. More recently, we've learned about the eruption of Thera, also known as Santorini, around 1600 BCE. This catastrophic explosion destroyed a thriving Bronze Age civilization, the Minoans, and may have inspired later stories of sudden destruction. But here's where the mystery deepens. If Atlantis was real, where did it go? Over the centuries, hundreds of locations have been proposed. Some searchers have focused on the Atlantic Ocean, taking Plato's description literally. They've looked for underwater plateaus, sunken islands, anything that might have once been above water. The Azores, a group of islands in the mid-Atlantic, have been suggested as possible remnants of Atlantis. Some have even proposed that the Bahamas or the Caribbean might hold clues. Others have looked closer to home. The Mediterranean has been thoroughly explored as a potential site. Santorini, with its catastrophic volcanic eruption, remains a popular candidate. Crete, the center of Minoan civilization, has also been proposed. Some researchers suggest that the story of Atlantis might be a distorted memory of real Bronze Age kingdoms that were destroyed by natural disasters or warfare. Then there are the more exotic theories. Some believe Atlantis might have been in Antarctica before the continent became frozen. They point to ancient maps that seem to show Antarctica without ice, suggesting that some ancient civilization knew what the continent looked like before it was covered in glaciers. Others have suggested locations as diverse as the Black Sea, the North Sea, even the waters off India or Indonesia. The challenge with all these theories is evidence. Despite countless expeditions and underwater surveys, no one has found definitive proof of Atlantis. No ruins match Plato's description. No inscriptions confirm the existence of the Atlantean civilization. The archaeological record is silent. This has led many scholars to conclude that Atlantis was simply a story, a philosophical fable created by Plato to make a point about power, corruption, and divine justice. Yet the legend refuses to die. Perhaps it's the human need for mystery. Perhaps it's the romantic notion that there might be lost knowledge, lost wisdom, waiting to be rediscovered. Or perhaps, somewhere deep in our collective memory, there's an echo of something real, a civilization that really did exist and vanish, leaving only stories behind. To understand what made Atlantis remarkable, we need to examine what Plato tells us about the civilization at the height of its power. This wasn't merely a successful city or even a prosperous kingdom. According to the ancient texts, Atlantis represented something unique in the ancient world, a society that combined advanced technology, sophisticated governance, abundant wealth, and far-reaching influence. The political structure of Atlantis was distinctive. The island was divided into 10 kingdoms, each ruled by a son of Poseidon or his descendants. These 10 kings held power over their own territories, but they were also bound together in a confederation. They met regularly to discuss matters of common interest, to settle disputes, and to make decisions about war and peace. This federal system, where power was distributed among multiple rulers who also cooperated for the common good, was unusual for the ancient world. The kings of Atlantis were bound by sacred laws, inscribed on a pillar of orichalcum that stood in the temple of Poseidon. These laws governed how the kings should treat each other, how they should resolve conflicts, and how they should exercise their power. According to Plato, the laws specifically prevented any one king from making war on another without the consent of the majority. They required the kings to help each other if any kingdom was threatened. They established principles of justice and fair treatment. Every 5 or 6 years, the 10 kings would gather for a great ceremony. They would hunt bulls in the sacred temple precinct using only wooden clubs and nets. No metal weapons were allowed. Once they captured a bull, they would sacrifice it over the sacred pillar, letting its blood run over the ancient laws. They would then drink wine mixed with drops of the bull's blood, swearing to uphold the divine commandments. This ritual reinforced their bonds and reminded them of their duties. The social structure of Atlantis was organized and stratified. At the top were the royal families, the descendants of Poseidon and Plato. Below them were the nobility, the wealthy landowners and military commanders. Then came the craftsmen, merchants and farmers who produced the goods and food that sustained the civilization. At the bottom were slaves, though Plato provides little detail about their numbers or treatment. The economy of Atlantis was based on agriculture, mining, and trade. The island was naturally fertile, producing 2 harvests per year. The Atlanteans grew grain, fruits, and vegetables in abundance. They raised cattle, sheep, and other livestock. Their forests provided timber for construction and shipbuilding. The land itself seemed blessed with productivity. The mines of Atlantis were legendary. Besides the common metals, copper, tin, iron, the Atlanteans extracted orichalcum, a mysterious substance that Plato describes as shining like fire. Scholars have debated for centuries what orichalcum might have been. Some suggest it was a type of brass or bronze alloy. Others propose it might have been amber, which can appear reddish gold and was highly valued in the ancient world. Still others believe it might have been a lost metal that we no longer know how to produce. The Atlanteans were master builders. The concentric rings of their capital city demonstrate sophisticated hydraulic engineering. They dug great canals connecting the rings, allowing ships to sail from the outer ocean into the heart of the city. These canals were protected by walls and gates. The walls themselves were architectural marvels, covered in metals and designed both for beauty and defense. The harbors of Atlantis were busy centers of commerce. Ships from distant lands came to trade goods. Atlantean merchants exported their agricultural products, their metals, and their manufactured goods. In return, they imported luxuries, spices, precious stones, exotic woods, fine textiles. The capital city was cosmopolitan, a meeting place for different peoples and cultures. Beyond commerce, the Atlanteans invested in public works. They built temples not just to Poseidon but to other gods as well. They constructed palaces for the kings and homes for the wealthy. They created public baths fed by hot springs, separate facilities for men, women, and even horses. They built a great racetrack where citizens could watch chariot races and athletic competitions. The city was designed not just for efficiency, but for the enjoyment and well-being of its inhabitants. The military organization of Atlantis was formidable. According to Plato's detailed account, the plain surrounding the capital was divided into 60,000 districts, each responsible for providing a certain number of soldiers. Each district had to supply 1 military leader, 6 horses with riders, 2 heavy infantry soldiers, 2 archers, 2 slingers, 3 stone throwers, 3 javelin throwers, and 4 sailors. If these numbers are accurate, the total military force would have exceeded 1,000,000 men, an enormous army by ancient standards. The Atlantean navy controlled the seas. With over 1,000 warships, they could project power across vast distances. Their merchant fleet was equally impressive, carrying goods and colonists to far-flung territories. The combination of sea power and military might made Atlantis the dominant force in their world. But what really distinguished Atlantis, according to some interpretations, was their level of technological and scientific achievement. While Plato doesn't explicitly describe advanced technologies, he paints a picture of a civilization that had mastered their environment. They had sophisticated irrigation systems, underground aqueducts, and the ability to channel hot springs for public baths. They worked with multiple metals and created alloys. They built on a monumental scale. Some modern writers have expanded on these hints, suggesting that Atlantis might have possessed knowledge that was later lost. They speculate about advanced navigation techniques, understanding of astronomy, even lost sciences that we've had to rediscover. While these ideas go beyond Plato's actual text, they reflect a persistent belief that ancient peoples might have been more capable than conventional history acknowledges. The culture of Atlantis, at least in its early generations, emphasized justice, wisdom, and harmony. The kings were meant to be philosopher rulers, governing according to divine law rather than personal ambition. The people were prosperous but not decadent, powerful but not oppressive. This golden age represented an ideal that Plato clearly admired, a society where material success didn't corrupt the soul, where power was wielded responsibly. But as generations passed, something began to change. The divine nature that the Atlanteans inherited from Poseidon became diluted. Human weaknesses began to emerge. The kings started to care more about wealth and power than about justice and virtue. Ambition replaced wisdom. Greed replaced contentment. The civilization that had been blessed by the gods began to turn away from divine principles. Plato describes this transformation as gradual but inevitable. With each generation, the Atlanteans became more mortal, more prone to human failings. They began to admire material things more than spiritual values. They wanted to expand their empire, to dominate other peoples, to accumulate ever more wealth and territory. The confederation that had been designed for mutual cooperation became a tool for conquest. This moral decline set the stage for the conflict with Athens. The Atlanteans, now corrupted by power, decided to extend their empire throughout the Mediterranean. They conquered Libya up to Egypt and Europe as far as Tyrrhenia. They were preparing to enslave Athens and the rest of Greece, when the Athenians, despite being vastly outnumbered, rose to resist them. The war between Athens and Atlantis is presented by Plato as a struggle between virtue and vice, between a small city devoted to wisdom and a great empire devoted to domination. Athens, though smaller and weaker in material terms, possessed something more valuable: moral clarity, courage, and unity of purpose. The Athenians fought not for conquest, but for freedom, not for wealth, but for principles. In Plato's account, Athens won. The Athenian army defeated the Atlantean forces. They liberated the conquered peoples. They stood as a bulwark against imperial aggression. This victory was meant to demonstrate that virtue and wisdom are more powerful than material might, that a just cause can overcome overwhelming odds. But the gods were not finished. Zeus, the king of the gods, looked down at the corruption of Atlantis and decided that judgment was necessary. He gathered the other gods and pronounced his verdict. The punishment would be swift and terrible. The earth itself would rise up against the Atlanteans. And so it came to pass that earthquakes shook the island, the ground opened up, and the sea overwhelmed the land. In a single day and night of destruction, Atlantis disappeared beneath the waves. This divine punishment served multiple purposes in Plato's narrative. It demonstrated that the gods care about justice and will not allow evil to triumph indefinitely. It showed that material power is ultimately fragile. The mightiest civilization can be destroyed in moments. And it provided a cautionary tale for Plato's readers, warning them that moral corruption leads to destruction, that societies must maintain their values or face catastrophe. The physical destruction of Atlantis was complete. The island sank. The people drowned. The magnificent buildings were buried beneath the sea. All that remained was a shallow area that made navigation difficult. Mud and shoals where once there had been an island. The very location of Atlantis was lost. Only the memory survived, preserved in stories and passed down through generations. For over 2 millennia, people have tried to make sense of Atlantis. The interpretations have varied widely, reflecting the concerns and knowledge of different eras. Each generation has found something different in the story. seen possibilities that earlier readers missed, or rejected theories that once seemed plausible. In ancient times, after Plato, reactions to the Atlantis story were mixed. Aristotle, Plato's own student, apparently dismissed it as fiction. According to later sources, Aristotle believed his teacher had invented Atlantis to illustrate philosophical points. He supposedly said that the person who created Atlantis also destroyed it, meaning Plato made it up and wrote it out of existence. This skeptical view influenced later classical scholars, but others in the ancient world took the story more seriously. Crantor, a philosopher who lived shortly after Plato, wrote a commentary on the Timaeus in which he claimed to have verified the story. He said that Egyptian priests had confirmed to him that the tale was recorded in pillars that still existed in Egypt. Whether Crantor actually visited Egypt or was simply embellishing Plato's original claim, we can't be certain. But his testimony shows that some ancient readers believed Atlantis might have been real. The geographer Strabo, writing in the 1st century BCE, discussed Atlantis in his geography. He noted that Plato's account contained geographical details that seemed too specific for pure fiction. At the same time, Strabo couldn't identify any known location that matched the description. He was left in a state of uncertainty, unable to confirm the story, but also unable to dismiss it entirely. Pliny the Elder, the Roman naturalist, mentioned Atlantis briefly in his Natural History. He seemed to accept that some land beyond the Pillars of Hercules had once existed and been destroyed. Pliny was interested in natural phenomena and catastrophes, so the idea of a land being swallowed by the sea would have fit with other geological events he recorded. During the Middle Ages, knowledge of Atlantis persisted, but was often mixed with Christian theology and medieval cosmology. Some Christian writers connected Atlantis with the world before Noah's flood. They suggested that Atlantis might have been an antediluvian civilization, destroyed in the same deluge that Genesis describes. This interpretation allowed them to accept the story while fitting it into a biblical framework. Medieval maps sometimes showed islands in the Atlantic Ocean that might have been inspired by the Atlantis legend. Islands like Brazil, Antillia, and the Isle of St. Brendan appeared on charts, though whether these represented Atlantis specifically or just general beliefs about Atlantic islands is unclear. Medieval cartography mixed real geography with legend, and it's often hard to separate the two. The Age of Exploration, beginning in the 15th century, renewed interest in Atlantis. When Europeans encountered the Americas, some immediately wondered if this might be connected to Plato's lost continent. The name Atlantic Ocean was already in use, derived from the Atlas of Greek mythology. Now there were vast lands beyond the Atlantic, previously unknown to Europeans. Could these be remnants of Atlantis? Or could Atlantis have been a stepping stone between Europe and the Americas? Francis Bacon's New Atlantis, published in 1626, reimagined the legend as utopian fiction. Bacon described a society in the Pacific, not the Atlantic, that preserved ancient knowledge and pursued scientific advancement. While Bacon wasn't claiming his story was literally true, he used the Atlantis framework to explore ideas about ideal societies and the proper use of knowledge. His work inspired later utopian literature and kept the Atlantis concept alive in the cultural imagination. The 19th century saw an explosion of interest in Atlantis, driven by several factors. Advances in geology revealed that Earth's surface had indeed changed dramatically over time. Mountains rose, valleys sank, coastlines shifted. If the planet's surface was dynamic, couldn't an island have existed and then disappeared? The discovery of ancient civilizations that had been forgotten, like the Sumerians and Hittites, showed that entire cultures could vanish from memory. Wouldn't the same be possible for Atlantis? Ignatius Donnelly's 1882 book, Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, became enormously influential. Donnelly, an American congressman with wide-ranging interests, argued that Atlantis was not only real, but was the original source of all civilization. He suggested that the survivors of Atlantis had migrated east and west, carrying their knowledge to Europe, Africa, and the Americas. According to Donnelly, This explains similarities between distant cultures. They all descended from Atlantean civilization. Donnelly's theories were speculative and often relied on selective evidence, but they captured the public imagination. His book went through numerous editions and inspired countless other works. It established many of the common beliefs about Atlantis that persist today, that it was highly advanced, that its destruction was sudden and catastrophic, that its legacy influenced later civilizations. The early 20th century brought more exotic theories. Occultists and esoteric thinkers incorporated Atlantis into their cosmologies. Helena Blavatsky, founder of Theosophy, claimed that Atlanteans were part of a series of root races that had inhabited Earth. She described them as spiritually advanced beings who possessed powers that modern humans have lost. Rudolf Steiner, founder of Anthroposophy, also wrote about Atlantis, describing it as a stage in humanity's spiritual evolution. These esoteric interpretations moved far beyond Plato's original account. They added elements like crystal technology, spiritual powers, contact with extraterrestrials, and lost sciences. While mainstream scholars dismissed such ideas, they became embedded in popular culture. Atlantis became associated not just with a lost civilization, but with mystical knowledge and alternative history. The mid-20th century brought more systematic attempts to locate Atlantis. Archaeologists and oceanographers began using new technologies to explore the seafloor. Sonar mapping revealed underwater mountains, plateaus, and valleys. Some researchers thought they might find evidence of sunken cities. Expeditions searched the Atlantic Ridge, the Azores, the Bahamas, and the Mediterranean. One of the most significant developments was the work on Santorini. In the 1960s, archaeologist Spiridon Marinatos excavated the Bronze Age settlement of Akrotiri on Santorini. He found a sophisticated city buried under volcanic ash, remarkably well preserved. The eruption that destroyed this city was one of the largest in human history, comparable to the eruption of Krakatoa. Marinatos and others suggested that this disaster might have inspired the Atlantis legend. The Minoan hypothesis, as it became known, had several advantages. The timing was roughly right. The eruption occurred around 1600 BCE, during a period when Egyptian civilization was flourishing and could have recorded the event. The location was in the right general area, the eastern Mediterranean not far from Egypt. The destruction was catastrophic and sudden, and there was real archaeological evidence of an advanced Bronze Age civilization being destroyed. However, the Minoan hypothesis also had problems. The dates didn't match. Plato placed Atlantis 9,000 years before his time, not a mere 1,000. The location was wrong. Plato specifically said Atlantis was beyond the Pillars of Hercules, in the Atlantic Ocean, not in the Aegean Sea. And the scale was different. The Minoan civilization, while impressive, wasn't the vast empire Plato described. Critics argued that at best, the Minoan destruction might have influenced Plato's story, but it couldn't be Atlantis itself. Other researchers proposed different locations. The geologist Angelos Galanopoulos suggested that Plato's dates might contain a translation error and that 9,000 should be 900, which would place Atlantis in the correct time frame for the Minoan eruption. Some scholars looked to other Mediterranean sites, Troy, Sardinia, Malta, even the Black Sea. Each proposal had its advocates and its problems. In the Atlantic Ocean, various sites have been proposed. The Azores, a group of volcanic islands roughly in the middle of the Atlantic, have attracted particular attention. These islands rise from the mid-Atlantic ridge, and some researchers suggest they might be the peaks of a larger landmass that once extended further. However, geological surveys show that the ocean floor around the Azores has been underwater for millions of years. There's no evidence of recent submergence. The Bahamas have also been suggested, particularly after photographs appeared to show regular stone structures underwater near Bimini. Some claimed these were roads or walls from an ancient civilization. However, geological examination revealed they were natural formations, beach rock created by the cementation of sand grains. The regular appearance was due to natural fracture patterns, not human construction. More exotic theories have placed Atlantis in Antarctica, arguing that ancient maps show the continent before it was covered in ice. The Piri Reis map, created in 1513, has been cited as showing Antarctica's coastline. However, cartographic analysis suggests the map actually shows the coast of South America, and the resemblance to Antarctica is coincidental. Antarctica has been covered in ice for millions of years, far too long for a human civilization to have existed there 9,000 years before Plato. Some researchers have looked beyond the Mediterranean and Atlantic entirely. The Sea of Azov, the Black Sea, even locations in Indonesia and India have been proposed. In each case, proponents point to local legends of floods or submerged lands, to archaeological sites that show advanced ancient cultures, or to geological evidence of land subsidence. But none of these locations match all of Plato's details, and most require substantial reinterpretation of the original text. Modern archaeology and geology have made the search more difficult, not easier. We now know more about plate tectonics, sea level changes, and the geological history of the ocean floor. This knowledge tells us that no large continent has sunk in the Atlantic Ocean in the past million years, let alone the past 12,000. The ocean floors are ancient, and their structure is well understood. There's simply no room for a missing continent. Similarly, archaeological surveys of the Mediterranean and surrounding regions have been extensive. We know a great deal about Bronze Age and earlier civilizations in this area. While new discoveries are still being made, the broad picture is clear. There's no evidence of a civilization matching Plato's description, no ruins of the right age with the architectural features he describes, no inscriptions mentioning Atlantis or Atlanteans, no artifacts that can be definitively linked to such a civilization. This absence of evidence has led most scholars to conclude that Atlantis was Plato's invention. They argue that he created the story to illustrate philosophical and political points. The tale of Atlantis demonstrates his ideas about ideal societies, moral corruption, and divine justice. The specific details make the story feel real, but they're crafted to serve the narrative, not to describe an actual place. Yet the search continues. Amateur researchers, authors, and filmmakers keep proposing new theories. Television documentaries regularly feature Atlantis, often presenting speculative ideas as if they were serious possibilities. The legend has taken on a life of its own, independent of Plato's original text. For many people, Atlantis represents the possibility that there's more to human history than we know, that ancient peoples might have achieved things we haven't imagined, that some great mystery remains unsolved. This persistence reflects something deeper than just interest in archaeology or ancient history. Atlantis has become a symbol of lost potential, of forgotten wisdom, of the fragility of civilization. It reminds us that even the mightiest cultures can fall, that knowledge can be lost, that the past might hold surprises. Whether or not Atlantis was real, the story continues to resonate because it speaks to fundamental human concerns about progress, decline, and the meaning of civilization itself. When we examine Atlantis through the lens of modern archaeology, we need to understand what archaeologists actually do and how they evaluate evidence. Archaeology isn't about seeking specific legendary places or trying to prove ancient stories true. It's about studying the physical remains of past human activity, reconstructing ancient societies, and understanding how people lived, worked, and organized themselves. Archaeological work is methodical and evidence-based. Archaeologists excavate sites, analyze artifacts, date materials using various scientific techniques, and build interpretations based on accumulated data. They compare findings from different sites, look for patterns, and try to understand the broader cultural context. This process has revealed a great deal about ancient civilizations, but it has also set strict standards for what counts as evidence. When it comes to Atlantis, the archaeological perspective is generally skeptical, but for specific reasons. It's not that archaeologists are dismissive of Plato or unwilling to consider his account. Rather, they apply the same standards they would to any historical claim, and by those standards, the evidence for Atlantis is lacking. First, there's the question of physical remains. If Atlantis existed as Plato described, a large island with a sophisticated civilization, monumental architecture, and an extensive empire, it should have left substantial archaeological traces. Ancient civilizations don't vanish without a trace. Even when cities are destroyed, even when they sink underwater, they leave evidence. Consider what we found from other ancient civilizations. Egyptian pyramids have survived for thousands of years. Sumerian ziggurats, though eroded, are still recognizable. The ruins of Greek cities, Roman forums, Mayan temples, all these remain visible despite millennia of weathering, earthquakes, and human interference. Even underwater, ancient structures can survive. Archaeologists have found submerged harbors, sunken ships, drowned settlements. Water can actually preserve things that would decay on land. So where is Atlantis? If it sank into the ocean as Plato describes, there should be ruins on the seafloor. Modern oceanography has mapped the ocean floor in detail. We've found underwater mountains, valleys, even evidence of ancient lakes and rivers. But we haven't found the concentric rings of the Atlantean capital. We haven't found walls covered in metal, canals connecting harbors, or any structures matching Plato's description. Some argue that the ruins might be buried under sediment, or that they've been destroyed by geological processes. This is possible, but it raises questions. Why would Atlantis be uniquely undetectable while other underwater sites have been found? Why would the destruction be so complete that literally no trace remains? Other catastrophic events, volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, floods, have left evidence. Why not Atlantis? Then there's the question of artifacts. Ancient civilizations produced vast quantities of objects: pottery, tools, weapons, jewelry, coins. These artifacts spread through trade, get lost, end up in trash pits or graves. Archaeologists find them scattered across ancient trade networks. If Atlantis had the extensive trade connections Plato describes, there should be Atlantean artifacts throughout the Mediterranean and beyond. But there are none. No pottery that can't be attributed to known cultures. No distinctive metalwork. No coins or inscriptions mentioning Atlantis. This absence is striking. We have artifacts from the Minoans, the Mycenaeans, the Phoenicians, and numerous other ancient cultures. We can trace their trade routes and see how their goods spread. But there's nothing we can definitely identify as Atlantean. Some proponents argue that Atlantean artifacts might have been misidentified, labeled as coming from other cultures. But this seems unlikely. Archaeologists are trained to recognize different cultural styles. They can distinguish between Minoan and Mycenaean pottery, between Egyptian and Mesopotamian metalwork. If there were a distinctive Atlantean style, someone would have noticed. The dating problem is also significant. Plato places Atlantis around 9,600 BCE, at the end of the last ice age. This is well before the rise of the civilizations we know about, before Sumer, before Egypt, before the city-states of Mesopotamia. According to conventional archaeology, humans at this time were hunter-gatherers or early farmers. They were just beginning to settle in permanent villages. They hadn't developed writing, metallurgy, or complex political organization. Could Atlantis have been an exception? Could there have been one advanced civilization while the rest of humanity lived in small tribal groups? It's theoretically possible, but it would require us to rethink everything we know about human development. Civilizations don't arise in isolation. They develop through the accumulation of knowledge, the growth of populations, the intensification of agriculture, and the evolution of social structures. These processes take time and leave archaeological traces. If Atlantis was as advanced as Plato suggests, there should be evidence of this developmental process. Where did they learn to work metal? Where did they develop their architectural techniques? Where are the earlier, simpler settlements that preceded the great capital city? Cultural evolution leaves a trail. We can see it in Egypt, where simple agricultural villages gradually developed into the complex society that built the pyramids. We can see it in Mesopotamia, where the first cities emerged from agricultural settlements. But for Atlantis, we see nothing. There's also the question of environmental evidence. Human civilizations alter their environment. They clear forests, cultivate fields, divert rivers, mine ores. These activities leave traces that geologists and environmental scientists can detect. Ice cores, sediment cores, pollen analysis. These techniques can tell us about past vegetation, climate, and human activity. If Atlantis had the large population and extensive agriculture Plato describes, it should show up in environmental records. But it doesn't. Some researchers have tried to find geological evidence for Atlantis. They've looked for signs of catastrophic flooding, sudden land subsidence, or volcanic eruptions that might have destroyed an island civilization. And indeed, such events have occurred. Sea levels rose dramatically as the Ice Age ended. Some coastal areas were inundated. There were major volcanic eruptions. But none of these events match all of Plato's details. The timings are off, or the locations don't fit, or the scale is wrong. The most famous example is the eruption of Thera, which we discussed earlier. This was certainly a catastrophic event that destroyed a sophisticated Bronze Age civilization. But it happened around 1600 BCE, not 9600 BCE. And Thera is in the Aegean Sea, not the Atlantic Ocean. To make this fit with Atlantis, we have to assume Plato got almost everything wrong: the date, the location, and many of the details. At that point, what are we really saying? That something inspired a story that became completely transformed. That's very different from claiming Atlantis was real. Another issue is the historical record. If Atlantis existed, especially if it had a large empire as Plato claims, other ancient cultures should have known about it. There should be references in Egyptian texts, Mesopotamian records, or the archives of other civilizations. Ancient peoples kept records. They wrote about their enemies, their trading partners, major events, and natural disasters. The Egyptians documented everything from military campaigns to Nile flood levels. Mesopotamian scribes recorded business transactions, astronomical observations, and historical chronicles. Where are the references to Atlantis? Some argue that these records might have been lost. Libraries burned, inscriptions eroded, papyri decayed. It's true that much ancient writing has been lost, but we have a substantial amount that survived. We have king lists, tribute records, diplomatic correspondence. We know about relatively minor kingdoms and short-lived empires. Why would Atlantis, supposedly a major power, leave no trace? The Egyptian connection that Plato mentions is particularly problematic. He claims Egyptian priests told Solon about Atlantis, and that these priests had ancient records describing the civilization. But we have many Egyptian texts, including temple inscriptions, papyri, and tomb decorations. We've deciphered hieroglyphics and can read what the Egyptians wrote. There's no mention of Atlantis, no story of a great Atlantic empire, no account of its destruction. This silence is hard to explain if the story was as important as Plato suggests. Could the records have existed but been lost? Perhaps they were in a temple that was destroyed, or written on papyri that decayed. But this seems like special pleading. We're asked to believe that one specific set of records vanished completely, while thousands of other Egyptian texts survived. And these lost records happen to be the only ones that mentioned Atlantis. It's possible, but it requires a long chain of convenient assumptions. From an archaeological standpoint, there's another consideration: the context of Plato's writing. Plato wasn't writing history in the modern sense. He was a philosopher who used stories and dialogues to explore ideas. Many of his works contain elements that are clearly fictional or allegorical. The Republic includes the myth of air. The Symposium contains the speech of Aristophanes about humans originally having 4 arms and 4 legs. No one takes these as literal truth. Why should Atlantis be different? Plato's account of Atlantis serves clear philosophical purposes. It illustrates his political theories: the ideal constitution, the dangers of imperialism, the importance of virtue over material power. It demonstrates his theology: the gods punish hubris and injustice. It provides a moral lesson: great civilizations fall when they become corrupt. These purposes don't require Atlantis to be real. In fact, The story works better as a parable than as history. Many scholars believe Plato drew on various sources to create his Atlantis narrative. He might have heard stories about volcanic eruptions or floods. He would have known about the Athenian-Persian wars, which could have inspired the conflict between Athens and Atlantis. He might have incorporated elements from existing myths or tales. But combining these influences into a coherent narrative for philosophical purposes doesn't mean he was describing a real place. That said, some archaeologists remain open-minded. They acknowledge that our understanding of prehistory is incomplete. New discoveries sometimes overturn previous assumptions. Sites like Göbekli Tepe have shown that Neolithic peoples were capable of more than we expected. Perhaps there are other surprises waiting. But being open-minded doesn't mean accepting claims without evidence. It means being willing to revise conclusions when new data emerges. What would count as evidence for Atlantis? Ideally, we'd want multiple independent lines of evidence, ruins or artifacts that match Plato's descriptions, references in other ancient texts, geological evidence of sudden land subsidence in the right time period and location, genetic or linguistic connections suggesting common ancestry with known cultures, environmental evidence of a sophisticated civilization in the proposed location. If even a few of these existed, the case for Atlantis would be much stronger. But we don't have these. What we have is a story written by a philosopher known for using allegory, set in a time period when no other advanced civilizations existed, describing a place that no one has been able to locate, leaving no archaeological traces, and mentioned in no other ancient records. By the standards archaeologists apply to any historical claim, this isn't enough to establish that Atlantis was real. This doesn't make the search worthless or the story unimportant. Archaeological research inspired by Atlantis has led to genuine discoveries. Explorations of the Mediterranean seafloor have found ancient shipwrecks and submerged settlements. Studies of ancient catastrophes have taught us about volcanic eruptions and climate change. The quest for Atlantis has motivated research that expanded our knowledge, even if it hasn't found the lost city itself. Moreover, the Atlantis story remains valuable for what it tells us about how humans think about the past. Why do we want to believe in lost civilizations? What does the persistence of the legend reveal about our relationship with history? How do myths and legends preserve cultural memory, even if they don't preserve factual accuracy? These are legitimate questions that scholars study, regardless of whether Atlantis was real. The archaeological perspective, then, isn't that Atlantis is impossible or that people who search for it are foolish. It's that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and that evidence is currently lacking. Archaeologists don't say, Atlantis definitely didn't exist. They say, we have no credible evidence that it did exist. That's an important distinction. It leaves room for future discoveries while maintaining scientific standards. For now, the archaeological consensus is that Atlantis was most likely Plato's invention, a philosophical fable, not a historical account. But archaeology is always provisional. Tomorrow, someone might discover something that changes the picture. That's the nature of the discipline. It builds knowledge gradually, revises understanding when warranted, and remains open to surprises. Until such evidence appears, though, Atlantis remains where it has always been. Not beneath the waves, but in the realm of story and imagination. Whether or not Atlantis existed as a physical place, its impact on human culture has been profound and enduring. For more than 2,000 years, the legend has inspired writers, artists, philosophers, and dreamers. It has shaped how we think about lost civilizations, ancient wisdom, and the fragility of human achievement. The cultural legacy of Atlantis extends far beyond the question of its historical reality. In literature, Atlantis has been endlessly reimagined. From Renaissance scholars to modern science fiction writers, authors have used the legend as a framework for exploring utopian societies, cautionary tales, and romantic adventures. Each era has created its own version of Atlantis, reflecting contemporary concerns and aspirations. During the Renaissance, when scholars were rediscovering classical texts and exploring new continents, Atlantis represented the possibility of forgotten knowledge. Perhaps the ancients knew things that had been lost in the Middle Ages. Perhaps there were lands beyond the known world where different forms of civilization had flourished. Francis Bacon's New Atlantis imagined a society dedicated to scientific progress, a vision that influenced Enlightenment thinking about reason and knowledge. In the 19th century, during the height of imperialism and rapid industrialization, Atlantis became a symbol of advanced ancient civilizations. Authors like Jules Verne used the legend in adventure stories. 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea includes a visit to the ruins of Atlantis, a moment that combines wonder at ancient achievement with excitement about modern exploration technology. The Lost Continent became a popular setting for romantic adventures, treasure hunts, and encounters with the exotic. The 20th century brought more complex interpretations. As people grappled with world wars, atomic weapons, and environmental destruction, Atlantis served as a warning. Science fiction writers imagined that Atlantis might have been destroyed by its own technology, a cautionary parallel to modern civilization. In this reading, the Atlanteans' fate reminds us that scientific progress without wisdom leads to catastrophe. The legend became a metaphor for the dangers of unchecked technological development. Fantasy literature embraced Atlantis enthusiastically. Authors created elaborate histories of the lost continent, inventing languages, cultures, and magical systems. Robert E. Howard, creator of Conan the Barbarian, set many of his stories in a Hyborian age that followed the fall of Atlantis. Atlantis became part of the backdrop for sword and sorcery tales, a mythic past that gave depth to fictional worlds. The legend also influenced esoteric and New Age movements. Theosophy, anthroposophy, and various occult traditions incorporated Atlantis into their cosmologies. They described Atlanteans as spiritually advanced beings who possessed powers modern humans have lost: telepathy, clairvoyance, the ability to manipulate energy. According to these teachings, Atlantean wisdom was preserved in secret traditions, passed down through mystery schools and hidden brotherhoods. These esoteric interpretations often combined Atlantis with other legends: Lemuria, Mu, ancient astronauts, crystal technology. While mainstream scholars dismiss such ideas, they've had significant cultural impact. They've influenced alternative archaeology, inspired countless books and documentaries, and shaped how many people think about ancient history. The esoteric Atlantis is less about Plato's actual text than about a generalized notion of lost ancient wisdom. In popular culture, Atlantis appears everywhere. Films from The Man from Atlantis to Disney's Atlantis: The Lost Empire have entertained millions. Television shows regularly feature Atlantis-themed episodes. The Stargate franchise created an entire mythology around Atlantis, reimagining it as an advanced city ship built by aliens. Video games allow players to explore virtual versions of the lost civilization. Comic books, particularly DC Comics with their Aquaman character, have created entire mythologies around Atlantis and its survivors. This cultural pervasiveness means that most people encounter Atlantis not through Plato, but through these modern adaptations. The legend has been filtered through layers of reinterpretation, combined with other myths, and transformed to fit different storytelling needs. Popular Atlantis often bears little resemblance to Plato's description. It's become a kind of blank slate onto which we project our fantasies about ancient civilizations. The persistence of Atlantis in culture reflects several deep-seated human tendencies. First, there's the attraction to mystery. We're drawn to unsolved puzzles, to questions that remain open. Atlantis represents the possibility that history holds secrets, that there's more to discover. In a world where so much seems known and mapped, the idea of a lost civilization offers adventure and wonder. Second, there's nostalgia for a golden age. Many cultures have myths about a better time in the past, when people were wiser, more virtuous, or closer to the gods. Atlantis fits this pattern. It represents a civilization that achieved greatness, then fell, a reminder that such heights are possible, but also fragile. This narrative appeals to something fundamental in how humans think about time and change. Third, Atlantis offers a critique of the present. By imagining a society that was advanced but fell due to moral corruption, we can reflect on our own civilization's direction. Are we making the same mistakes? Are we valuing the wrong things? Could our technological power lead to our destruction? The legend provides a framework for asking these questions without being too overtly political or controversial. Fourth, there's the romantic notion of lost wisdom. Perhaps ancient peoples knew things we've forgotten. Perhaps there were sciences or philosophies that could benefit us today if we could recover them. This idea is appealing in times of crisis or rapid change, when modern solutions seem inadequate. If we could just find the lost knowledge of Atlantis, maybe we could solve our problems. From an academic perspective, Atlantis has influenced how we study ancient history and archaeology. The search for Atlantis has motivated explorations that led to legitimate discoveries. It's encouraged interdisciplinary work, bringing together archaeologists, geologists, oceanographers, and historians. While the specific search for Atlantis may be misguided, the broader questions it raises about ancient civilizations, cultural memory, and catastrophic events are worth studying. The legend has also influenced our understanding of myths and legends themselves. Scholars debate how oral traditions preserve historical memories, how catastrophic events get encoded in stories, and how different cultures' myths might relate to each other. Atlantis serves as a case study for these questions. Even if the story isn't literally true, what might it tell us about ancient Greek knowledge, fears, and values? There's also the question of what the Atlantis phenomenon reveals about belief and evidence. Why do so many people believe in Atlantis despite the lack of archaeological evidence? What makes the legend compelling? How do people evaluate claims about the past? And what role does emotional investment play? Psychologists and sociologists have studied these questions, using Atlantis as an example of how beliefs persist in the face of contrary evidence. The commercial aspect of Atlantis is also significant. The legend has spawned countless books, documentaries, websites, and tours. There's a substantial market for Atlantis-related content. Some entrepreneurs have built careers around the search for the lost city, offering tours to proposed locations or selling books and videos about their theories. This commercialization sometimes obscures serious research, as sensational claims get more attention than careful scholarship. At the same time, Atlantis has educational value. The story can spark interest in archaeology, ancient history, and scientific thinking. Teachers use it to discuss how we know what we know about the past, how to evaluate evidence, and how to distinguish between fact and fiction. The debate over Atlantis can be a gateway to broader learning about the ancient world. In philosophy, Atlantis continues to serve the purpose Plato likely intended, as a thought experiment. What makes a society just? How should power be exercised? What's the relationship between material success and moral virtue? Can civilizations maintain their values as they grow wealthy and powerful? These questions remain relevant, and Atlantis provides a framework for discussing them. The environmental dimension has become increasingly prominent. As we face climate change, rising sea levels, and potential ecological catastrophe, Atlantis resonates as a warning. A civilization destroyed by natural disaster serves as a reminder of nature's power and our vulnerability. Some interpret the legend as an ancient understanding that human societies can collapse, that what seems permanent can quickly vanish. There's also a post-colonial reading of Atlantis. The 19th century interpretations, which saw Atlantis as the source of all civilization, carried colonial assumptions about cultural diffusion and white supremacy. Some writers used Atlantis to argue that European colonizers were simply reclaiming lands their ancestors had once ruled. Modern scholars critique these interpretations, noting how they served ideological purposes and distorted the original story. The digital age has given Atlantis new life. Online forums and social media allow enthusiasts to share theories, debate evidence, and coordinate searches. YouTube channels dedicated to alternative archaeology regularly feature Atlantis content. While this democratizes the conversation, it also allows misinformation to spread quickly. Distinguishing credible research from speculation becomes challenging when both are presented with equal conviction. Despite all the reinterpretations and additions, Plato's original text remains the foundation. Readers can still go back to the Timaeus and Critias, read his words, and form their own conclusions. The philosophical depth of Plato's work ensures that Atlantis means more than just a lost city. It's a meditation on power, justice, and the human condition, themes that transcend any specific historical claim. What's remarkable is that a story written nearly 2,400 years ago continues to captivate us. Plato couldn't have imagined that people in the 21st century would still be debating whether Atlantis was real, searching for its remains, and creating new stories inspired by his tale. This longevity speaks to the power of a well-told story and the enduring human fascination with mystery. Perhaps that's the real lesson of Atlantis. It's not about whether a specific island civilization existed 9,000 years before Plato. It's about why we need such stories. They help us make sense of our place in time, connect us to the past, and provide frameworks for thinking about the future. Atlantis has become part of our cultural mythology, a shared reference point that crosses national and linguistic boundaries. As long as there are questions about the past, as long as humans wonder what came before and what might have been lost, Atlantis will endure. It will continue to inspire new generations of searchers, dreamers, and storytellers. The legend has transcended its origins to become something larger, a symbol of human aspiration and vulnerability, achievement and loss. There's something deeply compelling about the idea of lost civilizations. Atlantis is the most famous example, but it's part of a broader pattern in human thought. Throughout history and across cultures, people have told stories about great societies that vanished, leaving only memories behind. What is it about these narratives that captures our imagination so powerfully? Part of the appeal lies in the mystery itself. Humans are naturally curious. We want to solve puzzles, uncover secrets, and understand what's hidden. An unsolved mystery activates something in our psychology, a desire for closure, for completeness. Atlantis represents the ultimate historical mystery. It's been discussed for millennia, yet remains unresolved. This ongoing uncertainty actually makes it more fascinating, not less. If Atlantis were definitively found or definitely disproven, it might lose some of its allure. The legend also speaks to our sense of impermanence. We build, we achieve, we accumulate knowledge and wealth, but nothing lasts forever. Civilizations rise and fall. Great cities become ruins. Knowledge is lost and must be rediscovered. Atlantis embodies this cycle in its most dramatic form. Here was a civilization at the height of its power, with everything it needed to endure, and yet, in a single day, it was gone. This reminds us of our own vulnerability. In modern times, when we can see satellite images of every corner of Earth, when we've mapped the ocean floor and sent probes to other planets, there's a longing for undiscovered places. Atlantis represents that possibility, the idea that there might still be something waiting to be found, some corner of the past that remains unknown. It's a romantic notion, increasingly hard to maintain in our thoroughly surveyed world, but one we're reluctant to abandon. The story also touches on themes of hubris and divine judgment. The Atlanteans were blessed with abundance and power, but they became arrogant and corrupt. The gods punished them for their transgressions. This narrative structure appears in many cultures: the Tower of Babel, the flood in Genesis, the fall of Troy. These stories warn against excessive pride and remind us that human power has limits. In a secular age, we might not believe in divine punishment, but we can still recognize the dangers of overreach. There's also an element of wish fulfillment in Atlantis theories. Imagine if we could discover proof of an advanced ancient civilization. It would validate the intuition that ancient peoples were more capable than mainstream history acknowledges. It would suggest that profound wisdom has been lost and could be recovered. For those frustrated with modern society, Atlantis represents an alternative path, a different way of organizing civilization that might have been superior to our own. This connects to the perennial human question about progress. Are we moving forward or declining? Are modern humans smarter and more capable than our ancestors, or have we lost something essential? Belief in a lost golden age, whether Atlantis, Eden, or any other mythic past, expresses skepticism about the narrative of inevitable progress. It suggests that advancement isn't linear, that wisdom can be forgotten as well as gained. The search for Atlantis also provides structure and purpose. For amateur researchers, it offers a quest, a mission that gives meaning to their efforts. The professional establishment hasn't solved this mystery, so perhaps an outsider can. This appeals to those who feel marginalized or dismissed by mainstream institutions. The hunt for Atlantis becomes a way to challenge authority, to assert that conventional experts don't have all the answers. From a psychological perspective, belief in Atlantis can fulfill several needs. It provides a sense of connection to the deep past, a feeling that we're part of a longer story. It offers hope that hidden knowledge exists, that secrets can be uncovered. It validates the importance of the search itself, making the believer feel they're pursuing something significant. And it creates community among like-minded searchers, people who share a passion and support each other's investigations. There's also a counterintuitive aspect where the lack of evidence actually strengthens belief for some people. Every failed expedition, every location that doesn't pan out, can be reinterpreted as evidence that Atlantis is still out there, waiting to be found in some other place. The absence of proof becomes proof of absence of having looked in the right spot. This pattern appears in many conspiracy theories and fringe beliefs. The lack of evidence is explained away rather than being taken as disconfirming. For others, Atlantis serves a different purpose. It's not about literal belief, but about imaginative engagement. Reading about Atlantis, watching documentaries, discussing theories, these are forms of entertainment and intellectual play. People can enjoy exploring the mystery without being committed to any particular conclusion. It's like enjoying a detective novel. The pleasure is in the investigation, not necessarily in reaching a definitive answer. The legend also functions as a repository for various desires and fears about technology. Some imagine Atlantis had crystal-powered devices, flying machines, or energy sources we haven't rediscovered. This reflects both fascination with technology and anxiety about it. On one hand, there's the exciting possibility of lost scientific knowledge. On the other, there's the warning that advanced technology led to Atlantis's destruction, a concern very relevant to our nuclear age and climate crisis. Atlantis additionally serves as a blank canvas for political and social projections. Different people imagine different forms of Atlantean government and society. Some see it as a utopia of equality and justice. Others imagine it as a stratified but orderly society where everyone knew their place. Still others envision it as a technocracy ruled by wise scientists. These visions tell us more about the dreamer's ideals than about any historical reality. The endurance of the Atlantis legend across so many centuries and cultures suggests it fulfills a universal human need for such stories. We need myths that explain where we came from, that warn us about possible futures, that give us heroes and villains, that provide moral lessons. Atlantis does all of this. Whether it was real or not matters less than the work it does in our imaginations. Atlantis isn't the only story of a catastrophic flood destroying a great civilization. Flood myths appear in cultures around the world, from Mesopotamia to South America, from India to Australia. Looking at these parallels can help us understand both what might be unique about Atlantis and what it shares with other traditions. The most famous flood narrative is the biblical story of Noah. God sees that humanity has become wicked and decides to destroy the world with a flood, sparing only Noah and his family. This story has clear thematic similarities to Atlantis: divine punishment for human corruption, catastrophic destruction by water, the survival of a few righteous individuals. The differences are significant too. The biblical flood is global, not localized, and it's about destroying all humanity except one family, not about one civilization vanishing while others survive. But the biblical flood itself wasn't original. It draws on older Mesopotamian flood stories, particularly the Epic of Gilgamesh. In this Sumerian epic, a character named Utnapishtim survives a great flood sent by the gods. He builds a boat, saves his family and animals, and afterwards is granted immortality. This story predates the biblical version by over 1,000 years and shows how flood narratives were deeply embedded in Middle Eastern culture. Why were flood stories so common in Mesopotamia? Because floods were a real and constant threat. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers flooded regularly, sometimes catastrophically. Cities could be destroyed, fields inundated, lives lost. It's natural that cultures living with this threat would develop myths about great floods. The religious dimension, seeing floods as divine punishment, reflects the human need to find meaning in natural disasters. Greek mythology itself contains another flood story besides Atlantis. The myth of Deucalion tells how Zeus decided to destroy humanity because of their wickedness. He sent a great flood that covered the earth. Only Deucalion and his wife Pyrrha survived by building a boat. After the flood receded, they repopulated the world. This story obviously parallels both the Mesopotamian and biblical traditions, suggesting widespread cultural exchange in the ancient world. In Hindu mythology, the Matsya Purana tells of a great flood. The god Vishnu, in the form of a fish, warns a man named Manu about the coming deluge. Manu builds a boat and saves seeds of plants and pairs of animals. After the flood, he becomes the progenitor of the new human race. Again, we see familiar themes: divine warning, righteous survivor, boat, repopulation. Native American cultures have numerous flood myths. The Hopi tell of multiple worlds, each destroyed by catastrophe, including floods. The Lenape have stories of a great flood sent to punish humanity. Pacific Northwest tribes tell of floods that reshaped the landscape. Each of these stories has specific cultural details, but they share the basic structure of devastating water destroying a previous age. Australian Aboriginal peoples have flood stories that are particularly interesting because they appear to preserve real geological events. Stories from multiple Aboriginal groups describe the flooding of coastal areas and river valleys, events that actually occurred as sea levels rose at the end of the Ice Age. Scientific dating of these geological changes matches the time frame suggested by the oral traditions, about 10,000 years ago. This shows that oral history can preserve information about real events across enormous spans of time. South American cultures also have flood narratives. The Inca told of a flood that destroyed the first race of giants. Various Amazonian tribes have stories of great floods that reshaped the world. The Muisca people of Colombia told of a flood that only a few people survived by climbing mountains. What do all these flood myths tell us? First, they suggest that major floods, whether local or regional, deeply impress themselves on human memory. Catastrophic flooding has occurred throughout human history, and such traumatic events become embedded in cultural narratives. Second, they show a common pattern of using floods as divine punishment for human failings. This reflects a universal human tendency to find moral meaning in natural disasters. Third, they demonstrate how stories spread and influence each other. Similar flood narratives appear in cultures that had contact, suggesting shared origins or borrowing. But Atlantis is distinctive in several ways. Unlike most flood myths, it's not about destroying all of humanity, but about the specific fall of one civilization. It's not primarily a story about starting over, but about the end of something great. And it includes more specific geographical and political details than typical flood myths. Where Noah's flood is cosmic in scope, the destruction of Atlantis is localized. Other civilizations, including Athens and Egypt, survive to remember it. Another distinctive feature is that Atlantis appears in a philosophical text, not a religious scripture or epic poem. Plato wasn't a priest or a bard preserving traditional stories. He was a philosopher making arguments about politics and ethics. This different context affects how we should read the story. It's part of a rational discourse, not a sacred narrative. Still, the similarities between Atlantis and other flood myths raise interesting questions. Was Plato drawing on existing flood traditions when he created his story? Did he know about the Mesopotamian or Greek flood myths and adapt elements from them? Or does the prominence of flood stories across cultures reflect real events that inspired multiple traditions? Some researchers argue that the commonality of flood myths points to an actual catastrophic event in prehistory, perhaps the rapid sea level rise at the end of the Ice Age, or a specific devastating flood that was experienced by multiple cultures. According to this theory, different societies preserved the memory of this event in different ways, and Atlantis might be one version of a shared catastrophe. However, skeptics point out that floods are common enough that multiple cultures could independently develop flood myths without sharing a single origin event. Floods are dramatic, deadly, and transformative. They're the kind of disaster that naturally becomes mythologized. We don't need to posit one great flood to explain why many cultures tell flood stories. The geological evidence is mixed. Yes, there were major flooding events as the Ice Age ended. Yes, sea levels rose dramatically. Yes, some coastal areas that were once inhabited are now underwater. But these changes happened over thousands of years, not in a single catastrophic event. There were certainly moments of more rapid flooding, but not a global deluge that destroyed all civilizations simultaneously. What's most interesting is how the flood myth pattern reveals something about human psychology and culture. We use stories about past catastrophes to make sense of our present and prepare for our future. We encode moral lessons in disaster narratives. We use them to explain landscape features, cultural practices, and social structures. The fact that Atlantis fits this pattern suggests it's serving similar cultural functions, regardless of whether it describes real events. The differences between Atlantis and other flood myths are as revealing as the similarities. Most flood myths are about wiping the slate clean, starting humanity over with a clean start. Atlantis is about loss, the destruction of achievement, the disappearance of greatness. This makes it a more melancholy story, less about renewal than about tragedy. This distinction might reflect Greek cultural concerns. The Greeks were acutely aware of the rise and fall of city-states, the impermanence of political power, the vulnerability of civilization. They had seen Troy fall. They knew of the Mycenaean civilization that had collapsed centuries before. They watched Athens and Sparta struggle for dominance. The idea that a great civilization could completely disappear would have resonated with their historical experience. In this light, Atlantis isn't just another flood myth. It's a Greek meditation on civilization and catastrophe, using the familiar motif of flood destruction, but applying it in a specific way to explore particular philosophical and political questions. The flood isn't about punishing all humanity. It's about what happens when a blessed civilization becomes corrupted by its own success. Understanding these connections and distinctions helps us place Atlantis in its proper cultural context. It's part of a worldwide tradition of disaster narratives, but it's also distinctively Greek in its concerns and purposes. Whether it preserves memory of a real event or is purely Plato's invention, it reflects deep and universal human concerns about the fragility of what we build and the certainty of eventual loss. Despite the lack of archaeological evidence, the search for Atlantis continues in the modern era, often utilizing sophisticated technology that previous generations couldn't have imagined. Satellite imagery, sonar mapping, underwater robotics, and advanced dating techniques have all been employed in the quest to find Plato's lost city. While none have succeeded in definitively locating Atlantis, these efforts have produced other discoveries and advanced our understanding of ancient geography. The 20th century saw numerous organized expeditions. In the 1960s and 70s, several teams explored the Mediterranean, particularly around Santorini, following the Minoan hypothesis. Underwater archaeologists surveyed the caldera, hoping to find evidence of a Bronze Age city beneath the waves. While they found remnants of Minoan civilization on the islands, they didn't find anything matching Plato's description of Atlantis. The Atlantic Ocean has received its share of attention. The Azores, being volcanic islands in the middle of the Atlantic, seemed like promising candidates. Expeditions surveyed the waters around these islands, looking for submerged plateaus or ruins. They found interesting geological formations, including underwater mountains and what appeared to be regular patterns on the seafloor. However, geological analysis showed these were natural formations, not artificial structures. The Bahamas became a focus of attention in the 1960s, after aerial photographs seemed to show regular stone patterns underwater near Bimini. These became known as the Bimini Road. Some researchers claimed these were ancient harbor works or roads from Atlantis. The story gained traction in popular media and attracted considerable interest. However, geological studies demonstrated that the road was actually beach rock, a natural formation where sand grains cement together. The regular appearance was due to natural fracture patterns in the rock, not human construction. Despite this debunking, the Bimini Road continues to attract believers. This demonstrates a common pattern in Atlantis research. Even when natural explanations are provided, some searchers prefer the more exotic interpretation. The desire to find Atlantis can overwhelm critical evaluation of evidence. Modern technology has enabled searches in previously inaccessible locations. Deep-sea submersibles can now explore the ocean floor at tremendous depths. Sonar can create detailed maps of underwater topography. Satellite imagery can penetrate water to reveal structures on the seafloor. Ground-penetrating radar can detect buried ruins. All these tools have been applied to the search for Atlantis. One interesting technological development is the use of satellite data to identify possible archaeological sites. Researchers have analyzed satellite imagery of various locations proposed as Atlantis, looking for anomalies that might indicate buried structures. This technique has been successful in finding real archaeological sites in places like Egypt and Peru, so applying it to the Atlantis question seems reasonable. In 2011, a team claimed to have found evidence of Atlantis in southern Spain, in the marshlands near Cadiz. Using satellite imagery, ground-penetrating radar, and underwater surveying, they identified what they thought were the remains of ancient walls and canals. The location was plausible, near the Pillars of Hercules on the Atlantic coast. However, follow-up investigations suggested these features were more likely natural or related to much more recent settlements. The claims generated media attention but didn't convince the archaeological community. Antarctica has been proposed by some theorists, based on the idea that the continent might once have been ice-free. Proponents point to ancient maps that supposedly show Antarctica before it was covered in ice, suggesting that some ancient civilization knew what it looked like. However, Antarctica has been glaciated for millions of years, far longer than human civilization has existed. The maps in question have been shown to actually depict other coastlines, and the resemblance to Antarctica is coincidental. The Black Sea has attracted interest following discoveries that it once had lower water levels. Around 5,600 BCE, according to one theory, the Mediterranean broke through into the Black Sea, causing rapid flooding that would have inundated coastal settlements. This catastrophic flooding might have inspired flood myths, including possibly the Atlantis story. Archaeological surveys have found evidence of submerged settlements along the Black Sea coast, proof that rising waters did cover inhabited areas. While intriguing, these settlements don't match Plato's descriptions of Atlantis in terms of date, scale, or cultural sophistication. Another area of focus has been geological and climatological data. Researchers have studied periods of rapid sea level rise, major volcanic eruptions, tsunamis, and other catastrophic events that might have destroyed an island civilization. Ice core data, sediment cores from ocean floors, and tree ring records have been analyzed to identify potential candidates. While this research has revealed much about past climate and catastrophes, it hasn't pinpointed an event that clearly corresponds to Plato's Atlantis in terms of timing and location. Genetic studies have been proposed as a way to trace possible Atlantean descendants. If Atlantis existed and some people survived its destruction, they might have left genetic traces in modern populations. However, this approach faces obvious problems. What genetic markers would identify Atlanteans? Without knowing what we're looking for, how can we search for it? And even if we found unexpected genetic patterns, how would we know they indicated Atlantis rather than some other unknown migration or mixing. Linguistic analysis has been another avenue. Some researchers have looked for common roots in different language families, arguing these might point to a lost mother civilization like Atlantis. However, historical linguistics has traced language families back quite far, and there's no evidence of a mysterious Atlantean language underlying known language groups. The similarities between languages can be explained by documented historical connections and common ancestry that doesn't require invoking Atlantis. The Internet age has democratized the search in interesting ways. Amateur researchers can now access satellite imagery, oceanographic data, and archaeological reports that were once restricted to professionals. Online forums allow collaboration and sharing of findings. Crowdsourcing projects have analyzed vast amounts of data, looking for anomalies. While this has mostly produced false leads, the broad participation reflects the enduring appeal of the search. At the same time, the Internet has also spread misinformation about Atlantis. Dubious claims can reach millions of people before experts have a chance to debunk them. Videos purporting to show underwater ruins, articles claiming definitive proof, and elaborate theories proliferate online. Distinguishing credible research from speculation becomes increasingly difficult for non-experts. Professional archaeologists generally don't participate in searches for Atlantis, at least not explicitly. The lack of evidence and the association with fringe theories makes it professionally risky. However, archaeologists do study ancient catastrophes, underwater settlements, and lost civilizations, just not under the banner of seeking Atlantis. Their research sometimes gets cited by Atlantis believers, often taken out of context to support claims the original researchers wouldn't endorse. One positive outcome of Atlantis-inspired expeditions is the development of underwater archaeology techniques. The desire to search for sunken cities has motivated investment in underwater surveying equipment, preservation methods, and excavation techniques. These tools have then been applied to legitimate archaeological sites, advancing the field as a whole. In this way, the search for Atlantis has had indirect benefits for archaeology, even if it hasn't found its primary target. Another interesting development is the increasing sophistication of geological knowledge about how islands form and disappear. We now understand plate tectonics, volcanic formation of islands, and the processes by which land can be submerged. This knowledge has allowed more informed evaluation of Atlantis claims. We can say with confidence that certain proposed mechanisms for Atlantis's disappearance aren't geologically plausible, while others are possible but unsupported by evidence. The use of archaeoastronomy has also been suggested. If Atlantis existed, perhaps it left traces in astronomical alignments or calendrical systems. Some researchers have looked for evidence that later civilizations inherited astronomical knowledge from a lost predecessor. However, independent development of astronomical knowledge is well documented across cultures. The similarities in how different societies tracked stars, marked seasons, and oriented buildings can be explained without invoking a lost civilization. What all these modern searches reveal is both human ingenuity and human tenacity. The tools we've developed are remarkable, allowing us to peer deep into the past and explore previously inaccessible places. The persistence of the searchers is equally remarkable. Despite repeated disappointments, the quest continues. This determination stems from a belief that mysteries remain to be solved, that the past holds secrets worth uncovering. Yet this same determination can lead to misinterpretation of evidence. When you're convinced something is out there, it's easy to see patterns that aren't really there, to overinterpret ambiguous data, to resist alternative explanations. This is why the scientific method insists on skepticism, peer review, and reproducible results. Without these safeguards, wishful thinking can masquerade as discovery. For the foreseeable future, the search for Atlantis will likely continue. New technologies will be applied, new locations will be proposed, new theories will emerge. Each will generate excitement, media coverage, and debate. Most will eventually be rejected as the evidence fails to support the claims. But the search itself has become part of the legend, an ongoing quest that adds new chapters to the story Plato began over 2 millennia ago. As we reach the end of our journey through the legend of Atlantis, it's worth reflecting on what this story means and why it continues to matter. Whether Atlantis was real or fictional, whether it lies undiscovered beneath the waves or never existed at all, the legend has achieved a kind of reality through its cultural impact and enduring resonance. For over 2,000 years, Atlantis has challenged us to think about civilization and its fragility. Every society, no matter how powerful, is vulnerable to destruction. The forces that can unmake human achievement are many: natural disasters, warfare, environmental degradation, internal decay. Atlantis reminds us that nothing we build is permanent, that the proudest empires eventually fall. This isn't a pessimistic message, though it might seem so. Rather, it's a call to humility and wisdom. If even Atlantis could fall, then we too must be careful. We must maintain our values as we grow in power. We must not let success breed arrogance. We must remember that material wealth and military might don't guarantee survival if we lose sight of what truly matters. The story also speaks to the value of what we create. Atlantis was, by all accounts, magnificent. Its architecture, its culture, its achievements, these made it worthy of remembrance. The fact that it was destroyed makes the loss more poignant. This underscores the importance of preserving what's beautiful and valuable, of recording our knowledge, of passing our wisdom to future generations. Civilizations can fall, but if we're careful, some of what they create can endure. There's also something in the Atlantis story about the relationship between humanity and nature. The sea that gave Atlantis its power, providing harbors, enabling trade, supplying food, was also the instrument of its destruction. This dual nature of the natural world is something we're increasingly aware of. The same climate that supports life can also produce catastrophic storms. The same seas that carry our ships can also overwhelm our coasts. Our relationship with nature is always precarious, requiring respect and understanding. The moral dimension of the Atlantis story remains relevant. Plato presented the fall of Atlantis as divine judgment against a society that had become corrupt and aggressive. In secular terms, we might say that societies that lose their ethical foundations eventually fail. Whether the mechanism is divine punishment or simply the consequences of poor choices, the principle is similar. How we use our power matters. A society that prioritizes conquest, wealth accumulation, and domination is on a dangerous path. The mystery itself has value beyond any factual resolution. Mysteries invite curiosity, encourage investigation, and inspire imagination. They remind us that we don't know everything, that reality might surprise us. In a world that can seem thoroughly mapped and explained, mysteries like Atlantis preserve a sense of wonder. They keep alive the possibility that important discoveries remain to be made. The debate over Atlantis also illustrates how we construct knowledge about the past. History isn't a fixed set of facts, but an ongoing conversation between evidence and interpretation. We constantly revise our understanding as new information emerges. The questions raised by Atlantis: how do we evaluate ancient texts? What counts as credible evidence? How do oral traditions preserve or distort information? Are fundamental to historical inquiry. For those who believe in Atlantis, the legend offers hope and purpose. It suggests that ancient wisdom exists, waiting to be rediscovered. It validates the feeling that mainstream narratives might be incomplete. It provides a framework for understanding patterns in history and culture. While scholars might disagree with these interpretations, we can understand their psychological and cultural functions. For skeptics, Atlantis serves as a case study in critical thinking. It demonstrates the importance of evidence, the dangers of wishful thinking, and the need for rigorous methodology. It shows how compelling stories can persist despite lack of support, how cultural desires can shape belief, and how patterns of reasoning can lead us astray. These are valuable lessons applicable far beyond Atlantis itself. What's certain is that Atlantis has earned its place in human culture. It's inspired countless works of art, literature, and scholarship. It's provided a framework for thinking about civilization, catastrophe, and loss. It's sparked curiosity and motivated exploration. Even if the physical Atlantis never existed, these cultural contributions are real and valuable. Looking forward, what will become of the Atlantis legend? In one sense, it will surely continue. New generations will discover Plato's text, wonder about its meaning, and add their own interpretations. New technologies will enable new searches, though with each advance that fails to find Atlantis, the probable locations shrink. New theories will emerge, each reflecting the concerns and knowledge of its time. At the same time, our understanding of the ancient world continues to grow. We're discovering more about prehistoric human capabilities, about ancient navigation and trade, about how early civilizations developed and interacted. Each discovery provides context for evaluating the Atlantis story. We're building a richer, more nuanced picture of the past, one that's fascinating in its own right, even without Atlantis. Perhaps the ultimate lesson of Atlantis is that the boundary between myth and history, between story and truth, is not always clear. Myths can preserve historical memories in distorted form. Historical accounts can take on mythic dimensions. The past comes to us through stories, and those stories serve many purposes beyond simple record-keeping. They teach, warn, inspire, and connect us across time. Plato gave us a story about a lost civilization, destroyed in a day and night of catastrophe. Whether he drew on real events, combined various myths, or invented the whole tale for philosophical purposes, he created something that has lasted far longer than Atlantis itself supposedly did. 2,400 years later, we're still talking about it, still arguing over it, still dreaming about it. In that sense, Atlantis has achieved a kind of immortality. Not the physical immortality of stone and metal, which ultimately crumbles and corrodes, but the immortality of story and idea, which can endure as long as there are minds to contemplate them. The Atlantis that matters most isn't the one that might lie beneath the ocean. It's the Atlantis that lives in our collective imagination, the Atlantis that challenges us to think about who we are, what we value, and what we might become. As we conclude this exploration, we're left with questions rather than answers, and perhaps that's appropriate. The Atlantis story doesn't offer neat conclusions. It opens up spaces for wonder, debate, and reflection. It invites us to engage with the past while thinking about the present and future. It reminds us that some mysteries might never be fully solved, and that the search itself can be valuable regardless of what we find. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of history's most enduring mysteries. We've explored the origins of the legend, examined the evidence and theories, considered its cultural impact, and reflected on its meaning. Whether you believe Atlantis was real or think it was Plato's invention, whether you're inspired to search further or content with the mystery, I hope this exploration has been thought-provoking and enriching. The story of Atlantis reminds us that human civilization is both magnificent and fragile, that our achievements are worth celebrating, but also vulnerable to loss, that wisdom and virtue matter more than power and wealth, and that some questions continue to resonate across millennia because they touch on fundamental truths about the human experience. If you enjoyed this journey, feel free to like and subscribe if it brings you peace. Thank you for listening.